Every year when Hannah and her husband's other wife went to the shrine in Shiloh to worship, Hannah cried out to God. She was miserable and prayed to God for relief. She pleaded for God's mercy. The other wife, Peninnah, thought this was funny and regularly laughed at her, made fun of her, mocked her, which of course only made Hannah feel even more miserable. Now, why would Peninnah do this? She liked to brag that she had children, and Hannah didn't, and even made a point of parading her children in front of Hannah. She was the B word. Not Peninnah. No, Hannah, because she was barren. And their shared husband, well, he was no better. He was no help. When Hannah was sad, she wouldn't eat. And Elkanah asked, well, what could be so wrong? And she told him. Now, what do you suppose he should have said to comfort her? Perhaps something like, I love you, my darling. More than even 10 children. But what do you suppose he did say? What, I'm not better to you than 10 sons? Mr. Sensitive and his other wife, Mrs. Cruel. So one year they were all back in Shiloh to worship, and Hannah went off by herself once again and cried out to God, look at my pain. Don't forget me. As she was in the middle of praying, from the depths of her heart, a priest noticed her and came over to scold her. Stop acting like you're drunk. Sober up. She said, no, sir, I'm just a very sad woman. I'm praying out of my heart to God. Now, why did the priest accuse her of being drunk? Because she wasn't wailing and howling. She wasn't creating any kind of disturbance. It was because she was praying by only moving her lips and not speaking out loud. I don't know how that makes somebody look drunk. But you wonder, well, why did she do that? And you think, well, she probably didn't want to attract any attention, either from a priest or Peninnah, who would notice and come over and make fun of her. So can you imagine how alone Hannah felt? She wanted just a private moment for her and God. And so Hannah was praying. And what do you suppose she was praying for? And of course, as you might expect, she was praying for a child. Now, we may tire of biblical stories that equate blessing with sons and the seeming plethora of stories that marvel at the miracle of a barren woman having children after so many years of hoping. But we have to respect the position this put Hannah in and recognize the significance it played throughout ancient times, because among other things, it made her worthless in the eyes of her husband and a source of mockery by other women. So Hannah prayed for relief from her misery, and she bargained with God. Oftentimes that doesn't work out, but Hannah said, if you give me a son, I will dedicate him back to you. He will serve you his entire life, and no razor will ever touch his head. And when she was finished praying, the priest who had accused her of being drunk told her to go in peace and said, may the God of Israel give you what you just asked for. And the next day the family went back home. She told Elkanah, let's go to bed. Not just to sleep. And 9 months later, there she was. She gave birth to a son and named him Samuel, which means I asked the Lord for him. She kept her promise. She'd always wanted a child, and so as painful as it must have been, as soon as she stopped breastfeeding, she took the boy, her only child, to Shiloh, along with a jar of wine, 20 quarts of flour, and a 3-year-old bull. and she gave her son to a priest named Eli to raise. Oh, can you imagine the pain of handing over your prayed-for son? But she didn't weep. In fact, quite the contrary, she sang. She sang, "The bows of mighty warriors are shattered, but those who were stumbling dress themselves in power. Those who were filled full now sell themselves for bread, but the ones who were starving are now fat from food. The woman who was barren has birthed 7 children, but the mother with many sons has lost them all. My heart rejoices in the Lord. My strength rises in the Lord. There is no other one holier than the Lord. There is no rock like our God." Powerful words that sound remarkably similar to Mary's Magnificat. Remember, the humble are lifted high, but the rich are the powerful are toppled from their thrones, and the hungry are filled with good things, but the rich are sent away empty-handed. And you know, her song, Hannah's song, also sounds like Miriam. So if you remember, when the people escaping slavery in Egypt, after they had passed through the Red Sea, she grabbed a tambourine and sang, "I sing to the Lord who is highly exalted, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." Songs by powerful women about reversals of fortune. Did you know, in fact, that women in ancient Israel are often credited with singing battle songs? So, by the way, Hannah, she went on to have 2 daughters and 3 more sons. And Peninnah was never able to conceive again. So there. So Hannah's story now shifts to Eli raising her son, whose own sons were rotten. And everyone knew it. They were disrespectful. They ate food from the sacrifices they weren't supposed to. They had sex with the women who served at the entrance to the tent, which I'm sure meant without those women's consent. And people kept coming to Eli to complain. But whenever Eli tried to change his son's behaviors, they refused and continued their wicked ways. And this went on for years. And finally, it was so bad that God, even God, complained to Eli and warned, if you don't set them right, there will be consequences. And so as time went on, God seemed increasingly absent. And it was rare for anyone to encounter a word from God or see visions. They continued the rituals, but lost their relationship. But there was one bright spot in Eli's life, thanks to Hannah, Samuel. And when he was 12 years old, while he was sleeping, he heard a voice and assumed it was Eli calling him to get up and help the now old and nearly blind man. Samuel wasn't familiar with the idea that he might hear directly from God, and so he said, "Here I am." But Eli is still sound asleep. And he yawned and he said, "It wasn't me. Go back to bed." And not long after, Samuel woke Eli up again and said, "Here I am." "It wasn't me. Go back to bed." And a little while later, once more, Samuel woke Eli up. "Here I am." Which is when Eli realized, oh, that must be God. And advised, if you hear the voice again, just say, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And indeed, it was God, and boy, did God have something to say. Not what I would expect, however. I would think, your first encounter with God, "Dear child, I have something wonderful and marvelous planned for your life." But what God had to say was a little more ominous. He said, "I'm about to make something happen in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear it tingle." Almost all the translations, almost all of them use the word tingle. But there's a few that say shocked or shudder. And based on what God's going to say next, I think it would have been more appropriate for the word to be translated shudder. Because God told this still innocent, wet behind the ear, wide-eyed, hopeful 12-year-old boy, "I am about to punish Eli's family for the sins of his sons forever. Their wrongdoing, their cursing of God, and at this point I'm done with them, and nothing can change my mind. Those are the first words that the boy heard, and can you imagine how broken his heart must have been? I mean, Eli was like a father to him, and he was afraid to tell him, but Eli said, "Don't hide anything from me." What did God say? And after hearing the verdict, Eli agreed it was what he deserved. It would be the end of his line. But remember, regardless of the failure of his own sons, Eli had done something extraordinary. Because he took Hannah's son and prepared him, and he became one of Israel's greatest prophets. Samuel grew up, and everyone from one end of Israel to the other knew that Samuel was trustworthy and that he was God's prophet. But as it turns out, his sons were pretty rotten too. He made them judges, but they tried to turn that into a profit-making enterprise, accepting bribes and perverting justice. And that leads to the next chapter in the life of Israel, where we will continue our ongoing story next time. So I've always identified with the story of Samuel. When I was 16 years old and thinking about who I wanted to become and what I wanted to do with my life, I knew there was one thing I didn't want to do. The thing that people thought I probably would. That's become a pastor. No way. No way. I bargained with God that I would be the kind of layperson in a church who did the things no one else wanted to do as long as I didn't have to become a pastor. But God didn't accept my terms. And God got to work through my dreams. The same dream, night after night after night, until I was really annoyed. I kept seeing myself in these dreams doing things that pastors do, things like standing in the pulpit or visiting in a hospital. And it happened to be that summer I was a youth delegate to the annual meeting of churches in North Dakota, and I saw some pastors I knew from summer camp and youth events, and I told a few of them about my dreams. And they all said, "Sounds like Samuel. Just wake up and say yes." And I didn't like that. So I rejected their advice. And throughout the summer, I kept having the same dream, night after night, until one morning I woke up and reluctantly took their advice. Honestly, feeling kind of defeated, I said, "Okay, enough already. If that's what you want, I'll do it." That's my call to ministry. All right already. But immediately, it was instantly, I felt washed in peace, like a bucket of water had been poured over my head. I got my answer clear as day, and I can't imagine doing anything else with my life. So the story of Samuel's call is really a true story for me. It makes absolute sense. But remember, this didn't start with Samuel. It all started with Hannah. Because through all that pain and grief she endured, nevertheless, she persisted. When she turned to God, God made her an active participant in changing the world, changing the mockery of her to power. She said, "Here I am." Now, is this a story you're familiar with, Hannah? Hannah's story is rarely told. Perhaps because it could be just another predictable trope. She was childless, she prayed, she conceived a son. But her powerful song shows she understood her role was much more than that. She sang, "The bows of mighty warriors are shattered, but those who were stumbling dress themselves in power." Wow, that's nothing less than revolutionary. And she said yes, and then she went home and told her husband what to do. Now, like many of us, Hannah experienced a lot of pain and grief. Some of it at the hands of those closest to her. But she was not resigned to bitterness. She repeatedly went directly to God and poured out her heart. She turned to God in very honest and raw prayer, and because of it, Hannah played this huge role in the epic story of Israel because she persisted in prayer. And what does that mean for us? The lesson isn't pray to God and you'll get what you want. Just keep at it. No, I think the lesson is being real with God. Because being real changes our potential. God welcomes us to share our pain and our grief so that we may become more than that. Can you be real with God?